Hello everyone, and today we're looking at the laws of the jungle. You may have heard this phrase in relation to business when there's a need to be ruthless. But what are the laws of the jungle? Well, another phrase that is sometimes applied is survival of the fittest, something that is quite close to Darwin's idea of natural selection. But what we're talking about aren't really actual physical laws, not like Newton's second law or something like that, but it's the basic principles behind the interactions between species. So the first distinction we need to make is between populations and communities. So in ecological terms, a population is all the members of a single species living in a habitat, which is an area where a species is suited to living. A community, on the other hand, is the collection of all organisms of any species living in an area. That might include the plants, animals, anything that is alive is the community. If you think of this in terms of ethnicities in human society, there are many different nationalities that may live together in a multicultural city, and together all of those different national populations form the overall community of the city. Although, of course, all of those people are still humans, we're dealing with ethnic differences there, not species differences. So there are many different factors which affect the size of different populations, and many different ways that these populations form part of the community. So what kind of things can cause population changes? Well, here is a population graph, and we can see that time goes along the x-axis while population size goes up and down on the y-axis. So which year, if we look along the x-axis here, do we think that this population was hit by a major disease? Well, if we look along the bottom, we see that it is about halfway through the third year from the left that there is a major drop-off in population. It goes from the highest point that it reaches straight down to the lowest point in a very, very short space of time. Becoming overpopulated is a common risk factor for species. It's definitely the sort of time that a disease might strike, but of course we don't know anything about what went on in this case. Other things that can affect a population are predators, that are other animals that eat members of the population, disease or parasites we've mentioned, competition with other animals trying to take the same resources. So we're not talking about predators now, we're not talking about animals that will eat members of the population, but we're talking about animals that will take their stuff. In other words, it will try and take the food that this population feeds on, or the water that they need to survive. Migration also, if members of the population move or spread to other areas, that is going to reduce the population in the original area where they live, and of course increase the population in the new area. And of course there are other environmental factors such as climate and a change in the local landscape. So what different types of interactions can we expect to see between different species? Well, we are going to break it down into three key ways. However, there are many ways of looking at these ideas, different ways of breaking it down. As with many things in biology, we don't understand it precisely yet, so, as we said at the start, we aren't able to divide it into clearly defined laws, but for our purposes, we're going to break species interactions into predation, an organism that consumes another organism, competition, when organisms of different species or the same species are all competing, they are all struggling to get a resource which everybody needs, and symbiosis, which is a longer-term relationship between organisms. As we said, there is some crossover between these three areas. So much of what we will go through depends upon the idea of coevolution. So what is this? Well, coevolution is when two species evolve in response to one another, for whatever reason. The most famous example of coevolution is the bees and the flowers. Over millions of years, species of bee and species of flower have developed this relationship in all the many different forms that you find them, where the bee comes and finds sweet nectar to feed on in the flower and to make their honey, but at the same time the flower will pass its pollen on to the bees and it will carry this to a new flower and fertilize a new generation of plants. So this is a mutual symbiotic relationship, but not only those relationships, predation and competition can also change over time, and both species can benefit by coevolution. So we're going to start by looking at the ideas behind predation. So what is predation? We've talked about it. It's an interaction between two organisms in which one organism, the predator, eats all or part of another organism, known as the prey. So the most familiar form of predation is the thought of hunting animals, ambushing and killing a prey animal. But this is not the only form of predation that exists. Strange as it may seem, herbivore-plant relationships can be thought of as predation. Here we can see the predators, the deer and the caterpillar, hunting and eating their prey, the juicy leaves on these trees. Now, you might think that this is more of an example of parasitism. The plant is not usually killed, so this is really just the deer and the caterpillar harming, but not killing the host animal. So really, are they just parasites? Well, maybe, but you could also say that the plant doesn't really care. It can still continue to grow. It's not going to lose most of its leaves. So perhaps it is not parasitism, but commensalism, a more neutral form of symbiosis. However, with symbiosis, it's more of a long-term relationship, whereas here, the caterpillar and the deer, they're just going to move on after they've finished feeding and probably find another plant to feed on next time. So this is why it does, when all is said and done, seem to be closer to predation than any of the other options that we have. If we now start thinking about traditional predator-prey relationships, then there are a couple of things that we can say. The populations of these species will follow each other over time, and over time each species will develop adaptations to help catch or escape from the other species. And this is, of course, a form of coevolution. So let's look again at population changes, now thinking more about a predator-prey relationship. So here we have two populations changing over time, and the top red graph is the prey animal, and the bottom blue graph is the predator animal. The first thing that we can say is that the prey animal will always have a higher population, a much higher population probably, than the predator animal. The energetics of consumption of food in the animal kingdom mean that each predator animal must eat many prey animals in order to survive, so there must be more prey animals for the predators to consume. If we look in the first year on this graph at the pattern that we see emerging, and the pattern that is indeed repeated over the subsequent years, in point 1 we see that the prey population begins to rise. Then at point 2, shortly after that, the predator population begins to rise. Then the prey population reaches a peak and begins to fall. And finally, the same thing happens to the predator population. So, why does the predator population follow the prey population? Well, until there are more prey animals, there is not enough food for there to be more predator animals, and so that's why you can't have more predator animals before you have more prey animals. But eventually, with more predator animals, they will start to consume too many prey, or perhaps some other event will cut the prey population. In any case, without enough food, the predator population will then begin to fall. So that is a population change cycle represented on a line graph, but let's just have a look at a slightly more simplistic diagram. So, starting with a low predator and prey population. Because there is a low predator population, that means that the prey population can increase. However, this now means that there is more food for predators, so their population can now increase. Once there are more predators, we can see that a high population of predators leads to a decrease in the population of the prey animal as too many prey are captured and eaten. Once there are not enough prey animals, that means some of those predators are going to have to die off or not be able to have children. Therefore, the predator population will fall and we come back to where we started. So before we go on to look at survival adaptations, let's just consider the process of predation. How do the predator and prey react at that crucial moment when each of them must succeed or die in their life's quest? So remember that both the predator and the prey want to survive, and it's those survival adaptations we spoke of that will help them do this. So we're going to break the process into 4 stages, some of which are not always needed. Certain different types of predator and prey relationships might work slightly differently. But essentially, what we start with is the detection phase, when both the predator and the prey need to find each other. Well, the prey doesn't really want to find the predator, but if there's a predator around, then they need to know about it. They need to be aware of each other in the nearby area. Then we have the attack and evasion stage. The predator tries to make a successful attack. The prey wishes to dodge or defend against that attack. We move from there into the capture or flee stage, where the predator must now secure the prey, which might still have some fight left in it. Meanwhile, the prey, if it has dodged the initial attack, must try and retreat from immediate attack range, must try and put some distance between itself and the predator. Finally, we reach the consumption escape phase, obviously very different for both predator and prey. If the prey has been successful in evading so far, then it now needs to flee beyond detection. In other words, so that the predator now no longer knows where it is, or at least that it can now no longer pursue. On the other hand, if the prey has been unlucky, then the predator must now protect and consume its meal. We say protect because the predator might not be the biggest thing around, and another even bigger predator, or perhaps even a stronger member of its own species, could potentially chase it away from its hard-earned meal, meaning that not only does it not get food, but it's wasted the energy that it took to catch that meal by not actually ending up getting to eat it. So there are, of course, a large number of different traits and behaviors that can help with this, and these are called adaptations. So we're now going to look at just a few of the different adaptations that we see in the animal kingdom. As we said, a survival adaptation is a way that an organism uses to help it survive in the predator-prey relationship, or perhaps just in the environment it lives. So an adaptation is based on the word adapt, which is a verb that means to change in response to something. So to change because something has made you change. So if a species needs to change to survive, that's why we call it a survival adaptation. Predators and prey often adapt to each other with new traits or behaviors, and of course, sometimes a thick winter fur, such as the one shown by the Arctic fox on the right there, can be useful for environmental challenges, not just for hiding from predators or prey. So the first kind of adaptation we're going to look at is physical defenses. So if you are too hard to eat, then predators will try to find an easier meal. So the snail shell that you see there is a form of physical defense. Crabs also have a hardened shell to protect their soft insides. Other types of organism, especially plants, may have grown sharpened spikes to deter predators. An interesting point is that when we see these sharpened spikes on an animal, then we typically call them spines. However, if they are on a plant, then they are more usually referred to as thorns. Toxins are another form of survival adaptation. These are deadly chemical substances, or perhaps not deadly, but certainly harmful chemical substances, and they are used by both predator and prey. A side note, there is a difference between poisonous and venomous creatures. Poison harms you when it is ingested, in other words, when you eat it. Venom harms you when it gets into your bloodstream, in other words, when it is injected or stabbed into you. So, as you might gather, predators often use venom, while prey tend to use poison. However, there are of course exceptions to both these rules. So predators often have a venomous attack that can paralyze or kill. The scorpion that you see there with its venomous sting is a classic example, but the odd tentacled fish you see there, much like many jellyfish, has tiny little spines on its tentacles which can pierce the skin and inject toxins which can be every bit as deadly as the more vicious looking scorpion that we see above. Meanwhile, prey animals like this frog or even a foxglove flower may have poisons of their own. This discourages predators from eating it. After all, you don't want to eat something poisonous, it might kill you, right? This in turn leads to another form of survival adaptation which some predators have developed, and that is poison immunity. If they are immune to the poison, then that means they can eat a certain organism which other predators might not be able to. Camouflage is another form of survival adaptation you might have heard of. If you don't have fierce weapons or tough armor, then your best plan is, like the ninja, to not be seen in the first place, like this lizard here, for example. So the formal term for camouflage in the animal kingdom is crypsis, and this is not just visual, but can be auditory or olfactory as well. In other words, it can be based on sound or smell, as well as just sight. Obviously, this can be an advantage for predators too. If you can get close enough to your prey that you can just jump straight on it when they don't know you're there, then this is a benefit too. So many predators also use different forms of camouflage to help them in the hunt. Finally, we're going to look at mimicry, which is another form of shape or color adaptation, but here it results from an animal trying to look like an object or possibly another animal. So a twig on a tree doesn't look particularly tasty to any predators, and that's why the stick insect tries to look as much like one as it can. Meanwhile, below we see the yellow moth has big black spots on its wings. These are supposed to look like the eyes of an owl. So if there is, for example, a bird or a mouse trying to hunt the moth, it can suddenly reveal these spots, and the predator will be finding itself looking at what it might think is a big vicious owl which is going to eat it, and it might be startled and forced to back off momentarily. Even if it doesn't last for very long, it might be long enough for the moth to make its escape. Other forms of mimicry might be to look like a specific species, and in fact this is called mimesis, mimicking a specific species. These two snakes look very, very similar, but they are in fact different species. The one on the left is a coral snake from Texas, and that is deadly venomous. Meanwhile, on the right, we can see a milk snake from Mexico, just south of Texas, and that is absolutely harmless. So, if you live in Texas and you go south over the border into Mexico, and you see a black, red, and yellow striped snake, you are probably not going to touch that. You are going to not take the risk. You will have grown up with the coral snakes, and you know not to go anywhere near it. The reason for something like this is, for example, in the case of venomous snakes, it takes actually quite a lot of energy to evolve the equipment and, of course, to manufacture the poison. It is a very sophisticated chemical, and making it in your body in a biological system takes energy. The milk snake does not need to use that energy, and it gets quite a lot of the benefits. Any predators that might be tempted to eat snakes are likely to leave this guy alone. On the other hand, it doesn't have the venom for the purposes of hunting its own prey, but overall it's obviously decided through millions of years of natural selection that that was not something worth investing in. Remember that none of these changes, none of these adaptations are ever actually planned by the species in question, but they do result from the continual change of co-evolution over long periods of time. So we just need to highlight the idea of an ecological niche, a small hole or space for something to fit in. That's what a niche is. An ecological niche is a suitable space for an organism to live. And in the ecological sense, this includes all the resources, including food, water, space, whatever, that the organism requires to survive. Sometimes these very same resources might be needed by some other organism in the same environment, and in this case, we say that the two niches overlap. So an overlapping niche happens when two organisms require the same resources, and so they must compete for those resources. Competition then comes when two organisms both need the same limited resource. Competition can happen in two forms. It can happen within the same species, in which case it is called intra-specific competition, or between different species, where it is called inter-specific competition. So let's just think about what animals might compete for. In the case of animals, they are going to compete for food, obviously, and going along with that, they will compete for water. They compete for space. All animals need space to live in, even if they don't actually build houses, etc. And of course, they compete for mates. They compete for the right to breed and have those all-important children which can lead to the next generation of their species. So in any form of competition, both plant and animal, there are going to be winners and losers. If there's competition for a niche, then in the end, one species will turn out to be better than others at using those resources. This principle is often true in many social contexts too. So this winning species outcompetes the other species. The outcompeted species will do one of three things. It might find a new survival strategy or a new resource, maybe a new way to eat, a new source of food. It could relocate to a different area where the winning species is not found, or it could just die out in an area. It might prove to be unable to adapt to a new way of surviving. What about plants? What do plants compete for? So they have slightly different but similar needs to animals. They also need food, although in this case the food is in the form of minerals and nutrients. They also need to compete for water, which of course all living things need. They need space, just like animals. You can't get too many plants crammed into a very small space. And plants also need light. In fact, they need it more than animals do. Photosynthesis depends on getting light from the sun. So the key thing to remember is that all of this coevolution is a continuous process. Adaptations exist for competition too. Animals may adapt to a particular ecosystem to take advantage of a new niche. As we saw, an outcompeted organism might have to adapt to take advantage of new resources within its niche, which essentially means it is slightly changing its niche. They may also adapt to be better able to use the niche that they live in. If there is a need to get better at using food more efficiently, or perhaps needing less water to survive, then that kind of adaptation will keep an organism and a species healthy over longer periods of time. One example of this is Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands. You can see that pretty meaty beak there on that bird, and that big strong beak allows it to crack bigger, harder seeds open and get more food out of them. On the other hand, on other islands, or perhaps in other climate conditions, the same species of bird might have a smaller, thinner beak, which allows it to more quickly eat large numbers of smaller, thinner shelled seeds. And here you can see an example of the different types of beak that you might see on some of Darwin's finches. So the final thing we're going to look at briefly is symbiosis. Symbiosis is a catch-all term for any kind of relationship between creatures that is not strictly covered above. Now, as we saw before, the difference between, for example, predation and parasitism is not always clear, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to break symbiosis down into 3 different types. We are going to, of course, look at symbiosis in another video, which you can see more details about, but for now, we're just going to explore the main 3 headings. So the types of symbiosis are parasitism, where one organism benefits from the relationship but the other organism is harmed, such as the tongue-eating fish louse that you see there on the right-hand side. This louse gets inside the fish's mouth, eats its tongue, and then replaces it, allowing it to chomp down on any of the other food that the fish might decide to eat. Commensalism is when one organism benefits from the relationship and the other one doesn't really care. So the cattle egret, the bird you see on the left there, is often found feeding on the flies that live on cattle, cows and wildebeest, etc. Now the cows have lots of flies buzzing around them and the birds can't eat them all, so the cows don't really care about the egrets, but they certainly aren't going to stop them, and so the egret gets to feed for free. And finally, we have mutualism, where both organisms benefit from the relationship, and we already talked about the relationship between bees and flowers and how they both benefit from that symbiosis.